I'm leaving the woman I love. I don't know if I'm making the right choice.
If you're leaving, please don't wake me.
At 11:47 on a cold Thursday night, David Carter sat alone inside his car with the engine turned off, a suitcase resting on the passenger seat, and his phone trembling slightly in his hand. He had been staring at the same message for almost 10 minutes. It was from Sarah Mitchell, the woman he had once promised he would never leave. The message contained only 9 words. If you're leaving, please don't wake me. David looked through the windshield at the house where the two of them had built a life together. A light was still on upstairs. Sarah was inside. She knew he was out there. And somehow, neither of them was going to stop the other. What makes this story difficult to understand is that David wasn't sitting in that car because he had fallen out of love with Sarah. He wasn't angry with her. He hadn't found someone else. In fact, the truth was almost the opposite. He was leaving because he loved her so much that he had convinced himself staying would eventually destroy everything they had. David had spent years believing that if you loved someone, you protected them. You worked harder. You made sacrifices. You built a secure future. You gave them the life they deserved, even if it meant carrying the weight alone. And by the time he was sitting in that car, he had done exactly that. He had worked late nights. He had accepted opportunities that took him farther away from home. He had told Sarah that the difficult years would eventually be worth it. He had promised that one day they would look back and be grateful they had endured the distance. But there was one thing David never understood until that night. Sometimes a person can spend years trying to build a better future and wake up one morning to discover that the future they were building no longer includes the person they were building it for. And Sarah had warned him, not once, not twice. She had warned him in quiet conversations, during arguments that ended with silence, in phone calls where neither of them knew what to say anymore. She had told him she wasn't asking for perfection. She wasn't asking him to give up his dreams. She was asking him to come home. But David heard something different. He heard pressure. He heard disappointment. He heard the fear that everything he had sacrificed might have been for nothing. So instead of admitting that he was afraid, he became distant. Instead of telling Sarah he needed her, he told himself she would be better without him. And slowly, almost without either of them noticing, the two people who once couldn't imagine spending a day apart began living separate emotional lives under the same roof. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But there was something David didn't know as he sat in that car. Sarah had been awake for hours. She had heard him moving through the house. She had heard the suitcase being dragged across the floor. She knew what the sound meant. She knew that when David finally opened that front door, their relationship might end without another argument, without another dramatic goodbye, and without either of them ever getting the chance to say what they had been too proud, too frightened, or too exhausted to say. And perhaps that was what made the moment so painful. After everything they had survived together, it wasn't hatred that was separating them. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't another person standing between them. It was two people who still loved each other, both convinced that walking away was the only way to stop hurting. David looked down at the message again. His thumb hovered over the screen. He could reply. He could tell Sarah he wasn't leaving. He could walk back inside, put the suitcase down, knock on the bedroom door, and admit that he was scared. But admitting that would mean admitting something else. That all those years of certainty had been built around a decision he was no longer sure about. And David Carter had spent most of his life becoming the kind of man who didn't change his mind once he made a decision. That night, however, he was about to discover that sometimes the hardest decision isn't deciding whether to stay. It's realizing that you may have already waited too long. At 11:47 on a Thursday night, David Carter sat alone in his car with the engine turned off, a suitcase resting beside him, and his phone glowing in the darkness. He had been sitting there so long that the windows had begun to fog around the edges. Across the street, the neighborhood was almost completely silent. But David wasn't paying attention to any of it. His eyes were fixed on the house in front of him, the house where he and Sarah Mitchell had spent years building a life together. The house where they had celebrated birthdays, argued over money, laughed until midnight, and once believed they would grow old together. His thumb moved across the screen again. The message from Sarah was still there. "If you're leaving, please don't wake me." 9 words, nothing more. And somehow, those 9 words were heavier than every argument they had ever had. David could have replied. He could have walked inside. He could have put the suitcase back where he found it. But he didn't, because by that point, he had convinced himself that leaving was an act of love. David Carter was 52 years old, and for most of his life, he had believed that love was supposed to make a person stronger. He believed that when you truly cared about someone, you did whatever was necessary to protect the future you were building together. He wasn't the kind of man who made decisions based on emotion. He calculated things. He planned. He worked. He saved. He thought about tomorrow before he allowed himself to enjoy today. And Sarah had always known that about him. She used to joke that David could turn a weekend vacation into a 5-year financial plan. He would laugh, shake his head, and tell her that somebody had to think ahead. She would look at him and say, "You think so far ahead that sometimes you forget where you are." At the time, David thought it was just one of Sarah's little observations. Years later, he would remember those words differently, because sitting alone in that car, with the woman he loved sleeping inside the house, David finally understood that he had spent years preparing for a future that might never arrive. Sarah Mitchell was 48, and she understood David in a way very few people ever had. She knew when he was worried, even when he insisted he wasn't. She knew that when David became unusually quiet, something was bothering him. She knew he hated asking for help. She knew that whenever life became difficult, his first instinct was to carry everything himself. And perhaps most importantly, Sarah knew that David's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. He wanted to fix everything. If the bills were too high, he worked more. If the house needed repairs, he handled them. If Sarah was worried, he tried to solve the problem. But Sarah didn't always need him to solve something. Sometimes she only needed him to sit beside her and listen. And that difference, small at first, would eventually become one of the reasons they found themselves standing on opposite sides of the same relationship. What makes their story especially painful is that neither David nor Sarah woke up one morning and decided they didn't love each other anymore. There was no single betrayal that destroyed everything. There was no dramatic stranger who appeared and stole one of them away. Their relationship didn't collapse because love disappeared. It weakened because life slowly became louder than the two people living it. Work became more demanding. Responsibilities increased. Conversations became shorter. Promises about tomorrow became more important than moments happening today. And research into long-distance relationships has found that communication and responsiveness can matter greatly to relationship satisfaction when partners are separated, which makes what happened between David and Sarah all the more understandable. But David didn't know any of that when he made his decisions. He only knew that he was trying to do what he thought a good man was supposed to do. PubMed +1. Years earlier, David had met Sarah at a small neighborhood cafe on a rainy Saturday morning. There was nothing remarkable about the day. No dramatic music. No unbelievable coincidence. Sarah had been standing near the counter, trying to balance a coffee, a phone, and a stack of papers when one of the papers slipped from her hand and landed near David's shoes. He picked it up and handed it back to her. She thanked him. He smiled. She smiled back. Then they went their separate ways. It should have ended there. Except David saw her again the following weekend. And then again. Eventually, what began as brief conversations became coffee together. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became long conversations about family, work, disappointments, and the strange ways people sometimes end up exactly where they were never planning to go. Sarah had already learned some difficult lessons about relationships before David came into her life. She wasn't looking for someone to rescue her. She wasn't searching for a man to complete her. She had built a life of her own and was comfortable living it. That was one of the things David admired most about her. Sarah didn't need him, and somehow that made him want to be there for her even more. David began noticing little things. The way Sarah laughed when she was genuinely surprised. The way she became completely focused whenever someone told her a story. The way she would pretend not to be tired because she wanted their conversation to continue. Slowly, without either of them announcing it, David stopped thinking of Sarah as someone he was dating and started thinking of her as someone who belonged in his future. For a while, everything seemed almost effortless. They developed routines that belonged only to them. Friday evenings became their time. Sometimes they went out for dinner. Sometimes they stayed home and cooked. Sometimes they simply sat together talking about nothing important. But those ordinary moments became the foundation of their relationship. David eventually met Sarah's closest friends. Sarah learned the names of David's co-workers. They began attending family gatherings together. People around them started assuming they were permanent. And perhaps that was the first time David became truly vulnerable. Because when you begin believing someone will always be there, the possibility of losing them becomes much more frightening. David had spent years protecting himself from disappointment. Sarah was the first person who made him willing to risk it. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. David's company offered him a position that could dramatically improve his financial future. The salary was substantially higher. The position came with greater responsibility, better benefits, and the possibility of long-term security. There was only one problem. The job was in another state. Taking it would mean spending months away from Sarah while they figured out what came next. David told himself it would only be temporary. He told Sarah that they could handle it. He promised they would talk every night. He promised they would visit each other. Most importantly, he promised that the sacrifice would be worth it. Sarah listened quietly. She didn't tell him not to go. She didn't demand that he choose her. Instead, she asked one question that David didn't fully understand at the time. What happens to us while you're building the future? David answered the way he always did. He said they would be fine. He said this was an opportunity they couldn't ignore. He said people made sacrifices for the people they loved. And technically, he wasn't wrong. There was nothing selfish about wanting financial security. There was nothing wrong with wanting professional success. The problem was that David had begun measuring the strength of their relationship by how much hardship he believed it could survive. Sarah was measuring it differently. She wasn't asking how much they could endure. She was asking how much of their actual life they were willing to give away while waiting for some better version of it to arrive. Neither of them realized that they were answering two completely different questions. Before David left, Sarah hugged him for a long time. She told him she loved him. He told her he loved her. They promised the distance wouldn't change them. They believed that because they had survived difficult things before, they would survive this too. And perhaps, at that moment, they genuinely believed it. But distance has a strange way of turning small problems into large ones. A missed call can feel like rejection. A short message can sound cold. A postponed visit can feel like a statement about priorities. Studies have found that communication patterns and perceived responsiveness can be especially important in long-distance relationships. David and Sarah were about to learn that lesson personally, and neither one of them was prepared for how quickly silence could begin speaking louder than words. PubMed +1. The first few weeks actually went well. David called Sarah every night. Sometimes they talked for an hour. Sometimes they stayed connected while doing completely different things. Sarah would read while David worked on his laptop. They would say goodnight and promise to speak the next day. Then David's new job became demanding. Meetings ran late. Deadlines appeared. Travel was added to his schedule. The calls became shorter. Sarah understood. At least, she tried to. When David missed a call, she told herself he was busy. When he forgot something they had planned, she told herself it wasn't intentional. When another weekend visit was postponed, she told herself that eventually things would settle down. But there is a difference between understanding someone's absence and being unaffected by it. Sarah understood David. She was still hurt by him, and David was changing too. He began feeling pressure to succeed because he had sacrificed so much to take the position. Every difficult day at work became another reason to push harder. Every promotion became proof that he had made the right decision. When Sarah complained about the distance, David didn't hear, "I miss you." He heard, "You're failing," and that frightened him. So he worked harder. When Sarah asked for more of his time, David became defensive. He started telling himself that he was doing all of this for their future. But Sarah wasn't living in their future. She was living in the present. And the present was a woman sitting alone in a house at night, waiting for the man she loved to call. Months passed. They still loved each other, but something had changed. Their conversations became less about dreams and more about schedules. Instead of asking, "How was your day?" they asked, "What time is your flight?" Instead of talking about where they wanted to travel someday, they discussed when they could next afford a visit. Their relationship had slowly become a series of logistics. And that was when Sarah began to wonder whether David still saw her as his partner or simply as someone waiting for him at home. She didn't know how to ask without starting another argument. David didn't know how to reassure her without feeling accused. So both of them began keeping things to themselves. And sometimes, the things couples don't say become more powerful than anything they could have said. One night, Sarah finally told him she was tired. David thought she meant tired from work. She clarified. She was tired of waiting. She said she didn't want to spend another year telling herself that their real life would begin later. David went silent. To him, those words sounded like an ultimatum. To Sarah, they were a cry for help. David asked her what she wanted him to do. Sarah didn't have an answer that would satisfy him. She didn't want him to abandon his career. She didn't want him to throw away everything he had worked for. She simply wanted him to understand that the relationship itself was becoming something they were sacrificing instead of something they were living. That conversation ended without a solution. David went to bed angry. Sarah stayed awake. Neither apologized. The following morning, they spoke as though everything was normal. That was how the distance between them grew. Not through one enormous explosion, but through dozens of small moments where one person wanted to reach the other and both were too tired or too afraid to make the first move. Research on romantic regret suggests that missed opportunities can become especially powerful sources of regret because people often see them as having long-term consequences. David had no idea that he was creating the kind of missed opportunity that could eventually haunt him. Sage journals +1. And then came the night when Sarah stopped asking him to come home. At first, David thought that was a good sign. He believed she had finally accepted the situation. He told himself that maybe she had become more independent. Maybe she had realized that the temporary separation was necessary. But what David didn't understand was that Sarah hadn't stopped needing him. She had stopped believing that asking would change anything. And there's a profound difference between those two things. When someone stops asking for what they need, it doesn't always mean they no longer need it. Sometimes it means they have begun protecting themselves from the pain of being disappointed again. That was the beginning of the end, or at least David would later believe it was. Because from that point forward, Sarah became quieter. She didn't complain as much. She didn't ask when he was coming home. She didn't argue about the late calls. She simply accepted whatever David offered. And David mistook her silence for peace. He didn't realize that Sarah was slowly preparing herself for a life in which David might no longer be part of it. Then, one evening, David came home unexpectedly. He thought Sarah would be surprised. Instead, he found her sitting at the kitchen table with tears in her eyes and a folder in front of her. She looked at him for several seconds before saying the words that would eventually lead David back to that car years later. "David, I think we need to talk about what happens next." And for the first time, David realized that Sarah wasn't asking him to promise her a future anymore. She was asking whether there was still a future for them at all. David stood in the doorway of the kitchen, still holding the keys to the house in his hand. Sarah remained seated at the table, the folder between them. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. David had expected anger. He had expected another argument about the distance, his work, or the endless promises that seemed to get pushed further into the future. But Sarah wasn't angry. That frightened him more than anything. She looked tired. Not physically tired, but tired in a way David had never seen before. She had the expression of someone who had spent a long time trying to make peace with something painful. David slowly placed his keys on the counter and asked what was inside the folder. Sarah looked down at it before answering. She told him it was a list of apartments in another city. David stared at her, trying to understand. Sarah had been thinking about leaving. David immediately felt something inside him collapse. He wanted to believe she was talking about leaving the house temporarily. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she wanted to stay with a friend. But Sarah explained that she had been considering moving for months. She had found a new opportunity in another state, one that would allow her to start over and stop waiting for a relationship that no longer felt like a partnership. David couldn't understand how she could make such a decision without telling him. Sarah looked at him and said that she had tried. She had tried through conversations, arguments, phone calls, silence, and countless hints that she needed more from him. But every time she tried, David became defensive. He thought she was asking him to choose between her and his career. Sarah said she wasn't asking him to choose. She was asking him to notice that she was disappearing from his life while he was busy building it. That sentence stayed with David. He wanted to argue. He wanted to explain the sacrifices he had made. He wanted to remind Sarah about the money he had saved, the opportunities he had created, and the plans he had made for them. But as he looked at her across that table, he suddenly realized something painful. Almost everything he was about to say was about what he had done. None of it was about how Sarah felt. He had spent so much time proving that he loved her that he had forgotten to ask whether she actually felt loved. It was a distinction he had never considered. In David's mind, love was measured by sacrifice. If he worked harder, saved more, and planned better, he was demonstrating love. Sarah measured love differently. For her, love was presence. It was conversation. It was knowing that when life became difficult, the person beside you would not make you feel like a burden. The argument that followed wasn't loud at first. David asked Sarah why she had waited so long to tell him. Sarah said she was afraid he would simply tell her to be patient. David said patience was necessary because their situation was temporary. Sarah looked at him and asked how long temporary was supposed to last. 6 months? 2 years? 5 years? David didn't have an answer. He told her that his career was finally moving in the right direction and that walking away now would destroy everything they had worked toward. Sarah quietly replied that she wasn't asking him to walk away from his career. She was asking him to decide whether he still wanted a relationship. David heard the accusation in her voice, even though Sarah hadn't meant it that way. He told her she was making him feel like everything he had done meant nothing. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She answered, "It means something, David. I just don't know if it means something to us anymore." That night changed the way they spoke to each other. They didn't break up. Neither of them said the words. Instead, they agreed to try again. David promised to come home more often. Sarah promised she would give him time. They both agreed that the relationship deserved another chance. For a few weeks, things improved. David started calling earlier. He arranged a surprise weekend visit. Sarah welcomed him at the airport, and for the first time in months, David felt the warmth he remembered. They spent the weekend walking around the city, eating in an old restaurant they loved, and talking about the early days of their relationship. They laughed about how awkward David had been when he first asked her out. Sarah told him that she almost said no. David pretended to be offended. For 2 days, they became the couple they used to be. But underneath the happiness was an uncomfortable truth. Neither of them had solved the problem. They had only remembered what it felt like before the problem existed. When David returned to work, he carried that weekend with him. He told himself it was proof that they could survive. But Sarah saw it differently. She had enjoyed every moment, yet she knew the moment would end. She knew David would board another plane. She knew she would return to an empty house. She began wondering whether love was supposed to feel like constantly saying goodbye. David didn't know she was asking herself those questions. He believed they were finally getting better. That difference in perception became important. When one person believes a problem is temporary and the other believes it is becoming permanent, they can be standing in the same relationship while living completely different realities. Then David received another promotion. It was exactly what he had been working toward. More money, more responsibility, more recognition. His co-workers congratulated him. His family told him they were proud. David called Sarah, expecting her to celebrate with him. She did congratulate him. She told him she was proud of him. But there was something missing from her voice. David asked if she was happy. Sarah said yes. David asked again. This time she paused before answering. "I'm happy for you." David heard the difference immediately. She was happy for him, but she wasn't necessarily happy about them. David became quiet. Instead of asking what she meant, he changed the subject. That was one of the moments he would later remember with painful clarity. As the months continued, David's career became more demanding. His new position required travel, longer hours, and constant availability. Sarah tried to adapt. She filled her schedule with work, friends, and activities of her own. From the outside, she seemed fine. She stopped waiting by the phone. She stopped asking when David would be home. She stopped checking his flight information. She became independent in ways David had once admired. But something had changed. Independence had become protection. Sarah wasn't building a life because she had stopped loving David. She was building one because she was no longer certain David would be there to build it with her. Then came a phone call that neither of them expected. Sarah's mother became seriously ill. Sarah called David late one night and told him she needed him. David was away on business. He promised he would come as soon as he could. But there was a major meeting scheduled for the following morning, one that could affect his position at the company. David told Sarah he would be on the first flight after the meeting. Sarah didn't argue. She simply said, "Okay." David assumed she understood. But when he arrived several hours later, Sarah wasn't waiting for him. She had already gone to the hospital. David drove there alone. When he finally found her, she was sitting in a hallway outside her mother's room. She looked exhausted. David sat beside her. For several minutes, neither spoke. Sarah eventually told him that she had been scared, not just because of her mother's condition, but because she had needed him, and once again, he hadn't been there when she needed him most. David explained that he had done everything he could. He reminded her that he had caught the earliest flight after his meeting. Sarah nodded. She knew he had tried, but she told him something he wasn't prepared to hear. "David, I don't want a man who does everything he can after the crisis. I want a man who understands when I need him before I have to explain it." David didn't know what to say. He had no defense against that. For the first time, he realized that being responsible wasn't the same thing as being emotionally present. That conversation created a wound between them that never completely closed. David became convinced that no matter what he did, it would never be enough. Sarah became convinced that asking David for what she needed would always make her feel guilty. So they both pulled back. David buried himself deeper in work. Sarah stopped expecting anything from him. Their relationship continued, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to recognize the couple they had once been. Friends noticed. Family noticed. Even David noticed. But nobody knew how to fix it. They had reached the point where every conversation seemed to reopen an old wound, and every silence created a new one. Then Sarah made a decision. She accepted the opportunity in another state. When she told David, he didn't react the way she expected. He didn't beg her to stay. He didn't tell her that he would change. Instead, he asked how soon she planned to leave. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. She had spent months hoping he would fight for their relationship. And now, when she finally told him she was leaving, he seemed to accept it almost immediately. But David wasn't accepting the end because he didn't care. He was terrified. Deep down, He believed Sarah had already made her choice. He thought if he begged her to stay, she would remain out of obligation rather than love. His pride and fear convinced him that letting her go was more dignified than asking someone to stay when they had already decided to leave. Sarah began packing. David watched her move through the house, placing clothes into boxes and removing photographs from walls. Every object seemed to carry a memory. Their first vacation, the restaurant where they celebrated David's promotion, a photograph from a family gathering, a handwritten note Sarah had once left inside his briefcase. David wanted to stop her. More than anything, he wanted to say that he finally understood. But the words wouldn't come. He believed that if Sarah truly wanted him, she would give him another chance without being asked. Sarah believed that if David truly wanted her, he would finally fight for her. They were both waiting for the other person to make the first move. The night before Sarah was supposed to leave, they sat together in the living room. There was no television, no music, just silence. Sarah asked David if he remembered the first time they talked about growing old together. David smiled and said he remembered. Sarah asked if he still believed they could have that life. David looked at her for a long time. He wanted to say yes, but he was afraid that saying yes would require him to make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. So he said, "I don't know." Sarah nodded slowly. It was perhaps the most painful answer he could have given her, because sometimes "I don't know" sounds less like uncertainty and more like rejection. Sarah looked away. David could see tears forming in her eyes, but she wiped them away before he could say anything. She told him that she had loved him more deeply than she ever expected to love another person. She said she didn't regret meeting him. She didn't regret the years they shared. But she couldn't continue living in a relationship where she constantly felt like she was waiting for permission to matter. David wanted to tell her she mattered more than anything. But once again, he didn't say it. He thought she already knew. He didn't understand that sometimes people need to hear the words you assume they already know. The next morning, Sarah left. David stood at the front door and watched her car disappear down the street. He didn't chase her. He didn't call her. He told himself that if they were truly meant to be together, they would find their way back to each other. It sounded reasonable. It even sounded romantic. But there was a dangerous comfort in that belief. It allowed David to avoid making a decision. He could tell himself that fate would handle what he was too afraid to handle himself. And for several weeks, that was exactly what he did. Then something unexpected happened. Sarah stopped contacting him completely. At first, David expected her to call. Then he expected a message. Then he expected something, anything, to show him that she was still thinking about him. Nothing came. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. David began checking his phone more often than he wanted to admit. He would open their old conversation and scroll through messages from years earlier. He would look at photographs. He would remember things he hadn't thought about in years. And slowly, the reality began settling over him. Sarah wasn't waiting anymore. For the first time, David realized that the woman he loved might actually be moving forward without him. And then, one afternoon, his phone finally rang. It was Sarah. David answered immediately. But the first thing she said wasn't, "I miss you." It wasn't, "I want to come home." It was something that made David's heart stop. She said, "David, there's something I should have told you before I left." And whatever Sarah was about to reveal would force David to question almost everything he believed about the last year of their relationship. David held the phone against his ear, barely breathing. For months, he had imagined what it would feel like to hear Sarah's voice again. Sometimes he had even rehearsed what he would say if she ever called. He imagined apologizing. He imagined telling her that he had finally understood. He imagined asking her to come home. But now that she was actually speaking to him, none of those words came. Sarah was quiet on the other end of the line. David could hear what sounded like traffic in the background, followed by a long pause. Then she said again, "There's something I should have told you before I left." David sat down at his desk. He asked her what it was. Sarah took a breath and said that during the final months they were together, she had received news that could have changed everything. She had been offered a position that would require her to move permanently. But that wasn't the part David didn't know. Sarah had already made a decision about the two of them before she ever packed her suitcase. David immediately asked her what decision she had made. Sarah told him she had decided to stay. For a moment, David didn't understand. She explained that she had originally planned to accept the position, move away, and begin a completely separate life. But then something happened that made her reconsider. She realized she didn't actually want a new life. She wanted the life she and David had talked about years earlier. She wanted the house, the quiet mornings, the traveling, the ordinary evenings, and the possibility of growing older together. She had been willing to give all of it up because she believed David had already chosen something else. But she had never stopped hoping that he would prove her wrong. David felt his chest tighten. He asked why she hadn't told him. Sarah's answer was simple. Because I had told you so many times what I needed, David. I was tired of asking. Those words landed harder than any accusation could have. David spent the rest of that afternoon thinking about the conversation. He went back through old messages, emails, and photographs. He looked at the dates. He remembered the arguments. He remembered every time Sarah had asked him to come home earlier, every time she had said she missed him, every time she had told him that she was afraid they were becoming strangers. David had always interpreted those moments as complaints about his work. Now he saw them differently. They had been attempts to keep their relationship alive. And suddenly, another memory came back to him. Several months earlier, Sarah had asked him a strange question. She had asked whether he would still choose her if he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. David had laughed at the time. He thought it was a philosophical question. Now he realized she had been asking him whether he knew the difference between building a life and actually living one. Sarah continued explaining what had happened after she left. She had moved into a small apartment and taken the new position. At first, she felt relieved. She thought distance would help her think clearly. But instead, every quiet evening reminded her of David. She would walk past restaurants they used to visit and remember conversations. She would see couples holding hands and wonder whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life. She even considered calling him several times. But each time she picked up the phone, she remembered the last conversation they had. David had said he didn't know if they could have the future they once imagined. Sarah interpreted that as his answer. She told herself that if David wasn't certain, she had no right to keep waiting for him. So she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She stopped asking him to choose her. David asked her why she was telling him all of this now. Sarah hesitated. Then she said she had recently received something that belonged to him. It was a box of old photographs and letters that had been left behind when she moved. She had opened it while unpacking. Inside was a handwritten letter David had written years earlier, but never given her. David immediately remembered it. He had written it during the first year of their relationship, when he was away on a business trip. He had planned to give it to Sarah when he returned. But life became busy, and somehow the letter remained inside a drawer. Sarah had found it by accident. She read it, and what she discovered inside was the man she remembered falling in love with. David had written that he didn't want to become a man who spent his entire life working for a future he never had time to enjoy. He had written that Sarah made him want to slow down. David was stunned. He couldn't remember writing those words. Sarah told him she had read the letter several times. Then she asked him a question that he couldn't answer. What happened to that man? David looked down at his hands. The truth was painful. He didn't know. Somewhere between promotions, bills, expectations, and the fear of financial uncertainty, he had become the opposite of the man who wrote that letter. He had become obsessed with security. He believed that if he worked hard enough, he could guarantee that nothing would ever go wrong. But life doesn't offer that kind of guarantee. Relationships don't either. David had been trying to eliminate every possible risk from his future, and in doing so, he had created the greatest risk of all. He had taken the person he loved for granted because he assumed she would still be there when everything else was finally in place. That evening, David made a decision. He was going to see Sarah, not because he knew what she would say, not because he believed she owed him another chance. He simply needed to look her in the eyes and tell her the truth. He booked the earliest flight he could find. On the plane, he replayed their entire relationship in his mind. He remembered the first cafe, their first trip together, their first serious argument, the night they talked about marriage, the plans they made for retirement. He remembered Sarah laughing at him when he tried to cook dinner and nearly ruined the entire meal. He remembered her sitting beside him when his father died. He remembered all the moments when she had been there without asking for anything in return. And suddenly, David realized that love wasn't hidden in the grand promises they had made. It had been hidden in the ordinary moments he had failed to appreciate. When David arrived in Sarah's city, he didn't call her immediately. He sat in the rental car outside the building where she lived. He was nervous, more nervous than he had been before any important business meeting. He had spent years becoming comfortable with decisions, but this wasn't a business decision. There was no strategy, no warranty, no calculation that could tell him whether Sarah would open the door or tell him to leave. Eventually, he called. Sarah answered. David told her he was outside. There was a long silence. Then Sarah asked why. David said he needed to talk to her in person. Sarah didn't immediately agree. She asked if he was expecting something from her. David said no. That answer surprised her. After a moment, she told him to come upstairs. When Sarah opened the door, David almost forgot what he had planned to say. She looked familiar and completely different at the same time. Her hair was slightly shorter. She looked healthier, more confident, but there was still something in her eyes that reminded him of the woman he had fallen in love with. David stepped inside. Neither of them hugged. Neither of them knew whether they were allowed to. Sarah offered him coffee. David smiled because it was such a normal thing to say after everything they had been through. He told her he didn't want coffee. He just wanted to talk. Sarah sat down. David remained standing for a moment before finally taking the chair opposite her. Then he said the words he should have said months earlier. I was wrong. Sarah didn't respond immediately. David continued. He told her he had spent years believing that love meant making sacrifices. He had convinced himself that if he provided enough, earned enough, and planned enough, he would eventually create a perfect future for them. But he had forgotten that Sarah wasn't asking for a perfect future. She wanted a life with him in the present. He admitted that every time she told him she was lonely, he heard criticism instead of pain. Every time she asked him to come home, he heard an attack on his career. Every time she became quiet, he assumed she was becoming independent. He now understood that she had been protecting herself because she was exhausted from being disappointed. David's voice broke as he said, I thought I was sacrificing for us. I didn't realize I was asking you to sacrifice us. Sarah looked down. Tears began falling, but she didn't wipe them away. She told David she had waited a long time to hear those words. But she also told him that hearing them didn't erase what had happened. David nodded. He knew that. He wasn't there to demand forgiveness. He wasn't there to convince her that everything could return to the way it had been. He simply wanted to be honest for once. Sarah asked him what would happen if she gave him another chance. David admitted that he couldn't promise everything would be easy. He couldn't promise there would never be another difficult period. But he could promise something different. He would stop assuming that love could survive without attention. He would stop treating Sarah like someone who would always be waiting. And most importantly, he would stop making decisions for both of them. Sarah listened quietly. Then she asked him the question he had been avoiding for years. If you had to choose today, David, between the life you thought you wanted and the life we could actually build together, what would you choose? David didn't hesitate this time. He told her he would choose the life they could build together. But Sarah shook her head slightly. She said that wasn't enough. David looked confused. She explained that she didn't want to be chosen because he had finally realized what he had lost. She wanted to be chosen because he genuinely wanted the life they could have together. There was a difference. David understood. This wasn't about rescuing a relationship that was already broken. It was about deciding whether they were willing to build something new from what remained. For the first time in months, they talked without defending themselves. Sarah told David how lonely she had been. She told him how many nights she had stared at her phone, hoping he would call. She admitted that there were moments when she hated herself for still loving him. David told her about the pressure he had felt at work. He explained how terrified he was of failing. He admitted that his obsession with financial security came from watching his own family struggle when he was younger. He had promised himself that he would never allow the person he loved to experience that kind of uncertainty. But Sarah told him that security meant very little if she had to experience emotional loneliness to obtain it. David finally understood that they had both been trying to protect each other from different fears. They spent several hours talking. Eventually, Sarah asked him whether he had told his company that he might change his position. David hadn't. He had only just begun considering it. Sarah told him not to make a sudden decision because of her. She didn't want him to abandon everything and later blame her for it. David smiled sadly. He told her that was exactly what the old version of him would have done. He would have made one dramatic decision and called it love. But he wasn't interested in dramatic gestures anymore. He wanted to make deliberate choices. He wanted them to sit down and figure out what their life could realistically look like, where they would live, how they would handle work, how they would communicate, what they want in the next 5 years. For the first time, David wasn't promising a fantasy. He was offering a plan. Sarah didn't give him an answer that night. She told him she needed time. David accepted it. He returned to his hotel alone. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to control the outcome. He had told Sarah the truth and accepted that the decision now belonged to both of them. The following morning, he returned to work. He requested a meeting with his employer and explained that he needed to reconsider his current arrangement. It wasn't an easy conversation. His career had become a major part of his identity. Walking away from certain opportunities meant giving up money, status, and professional momentum. But David had finally learned something that Sarah had been trying to teach him for years. A sacrifice only has meaning if the person you're sacrificing for actually wants it. He wasn't going to make another decision that affected both of them without allowing Sarah to be part of it. Weeks passed. David and Sarah began speaking again. Not every day, not as a couple, just two people cautiously rebuilding trust. They talked about ordinary things: work, family, books, dinner. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes old wounds surfaced, but neither of them ran away. David started visiting Sarah occasionally. They would have dinner and talk. There were moments when it almost felt like the old days. But both knew they couldn't simply pretend the past hadn't happened. They had to understand it. Then one evening, Sarah asked David to come over. When he arrived, she was standing by the window, holding the old letter he had written years earlier. She handed it back to him. David looked at the paper. Then Sarah said something he would remember for the rest of his life. "I don't want the man who wrote this letter back." David looked at her, confused. Sarah continued, "I want the man who finally understands what the letter meant." And for the first time, David realized that getting Sarah back was not the real challenge. The real challenge was becoming the man who would know how to keep her. But neither of them knew yet whether they would actually get that chance. Because while David was trying to rebuild what they had lost, another decision was approaching. One that would force Sarah to choose between protecting her heart and giving David one final opportunity. And this time, there would be no guarantee that love alone would be enough. For the first time in years, David Carter stopped trying to convince Sarah Mitchell that everything would work out. He had finally understood that promises were easy when there was nothing at stake. What mattered now was what he was willing to do when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. Over the following weeks, David and Sarah continued speaking, but they moved carefully. There were no declarations about forever, no promises that they would never hurt each other again. They simply started spending time together. A dinner here, a long conversation there. Sometimes David would drive across town just to sit with Sarah for an hour. Other times, Sarah would call him after a difficult day and tell him about something that had happened at work. They were rebuilding something neither of them could name yet. But underneath every conversation was the same question. Could two people who had once loved each other deeply learn how to trust each other again after spending so long feeling alone? David's biggest challenge was accepting that Sarah no longer believed his words automatically. Before everything fell apart, if David said he would call, she waited for the call. If he said he was coming home, she believed him. If he promised that something would change, she gave him the benefit of the doubt. That trust had disappeared slowly, one broken promise at a time. David couldn't demand it back. He had to earn it. And earning it meant doing something he had never been particularly good at, being consistent without expecting immediate results. He started calling when he said he would. If he couldn't make a visit, he told Sarah early instead of waiting until the last minute. When she was upset, he stopped trying to fix everything. He listened. Sometimes he didn't have an answer. Sometimes Sarah didn't need one. She simply needed to know that he was there. But just as things began improving, David received another offer from his company. It was the kind of opportunity he had once dreamed about. A senior leadership position, more money, more authority, a chance to become one of the most influential people in the company. The position came with a requirement that immediately made David's stomach tighten. It would mean moving to another state for at least 3 years. The old David would have accepted before the conversation ended. The old David would have told himself that the sacrifice was necessary. He would have promised Sarah they would figure it out. But this time, he didn't answer. He went home, sat alone at his kitchen table, and stared at the offer. For years, this was exactly what he thought success looked like. Yet now, the number on the contract didn't excite him the way it once would have. All he could think about was Sarah. David could have hidden the offer from her. He could have made the decision himself and presented it as something they simply had to deal with. Instead, he called Sarah and asked if they could meet. When they sat down together, David placed the documents on the table. Sarah read them carefully. Then she looked at him. "What are you going to do?" she asked. David told her he didn't know. Sarah seemed surprised. She asked why. David said, because this time, he wanted to know what she wanted before making a decision that affected both of them. Sarah looked down at the papers again. Then she told him something he wasn't expecting. She wanted him to take the opportunity if it was genuinely what he wanted. David asked whether she would be okay with another long-distance relationship. Sarah shook her head. She said she didn't know, but she also said she didn't want to become the reason he gave up something important and eventually resented her. That conversation exposed another problem. David had spent years assuming that choosing Sarah meant giving something else up. Sarah had spent years fearing that if David chose her, he would eventually blame her for the opportunities he lost. Both were still trapped in the same old fear. David believed love required sacrifice. Sarah believed being loved meant becoming someone's sacrifice. Neither was healthy. They needed to stop treating their relationship like a competition between love and ambition. The real question wasn't whether David should have a career or a relationship. It was whether they could build a life where both mattered. For the first time, they began talking practically. Could David negotiate a different position? Could Sarah move? Could they spend certain months in one place and others somewhere else? Could they build their relationship around their actual lives instead of waiting for their lives to become easier? The conversations weren't romantic. They were sometimes uncomfortable, but they were real. And slowly, something changed between them. David stopped trying to impress Sarah. Sarah stopped testing David. They began communicating like two adults who understood that love didn't remove practical problems. It simply gave them a reason to solve them together. David eventually negotiated with his company. He couldn't keep the exact position without relocating, but there was another option. He could take a smaller leadership role and remain where he was. It meant less money and slower advancement. A few years earlier, he would have considered that failure. Now he saw it differently. He wasn't choosing Sarah instead of success. He was choosing a version of success that didn't require him to abandon the person he loved. When David told Sarah what he had decided, she didn't celebrate immediately. Instead, she asked whether he was sure. He told her he was. She asked whether he would regret the money he was leaving behind. David thought about it. Then he said something simple. "I might regret the money. I don't want to regret losing you." Sarah looked away, and tears filled her eyes. But even then, she didn't rush into his arms. She told him that his decision didn't erase the past. David agreed. He didn't expect it to. He told her that he wasn't asking her to forget what happened. He was asking whether they could start learning from it. That was the moment Sarah finally understood that David wasn't making another grand promise. He was making a different kind of choice. They started seeing each other more regularly. Their relationship slowly became something new. It wasn't the intense romance of the beginning. It was quieter, more mature. They talked about money, family, aging, retirement, where they wanted to live. What would happen if one of them became sick? What kind of life they wanted when their careers eventually slowed down. These conversations might not sound romantic to someone younger, but to David and Sarah, they were more intimate than any grand gesture. They were finally planning a future based on reality. And for the first time, neither person felt like they were waiting for the other to become someone else. Then Sarah received a phone call that changed everything again. It was about her mother. Her mother's condition had worsened, and Sarah needed to make some difficult decisions about her care. David immediately offered to help. But this time, he didn't assume what she needed. He asked. Sarah told him she needed someone to sit with her while she figured things out. So David sat beside her. He didn't give advice. He didn't make a plan. He simply stayed. At one point, Sarah leaned against his shoulder and closed her eyes. David looked down at her and realized how much he had missed these ordinary moments. Not the vacations, not the expensive dinners, not the achievements. This, sitting beside someone when life was difficult and making sure they didn't have to face it alone. Sarah eventually looked at him and said, "This is what I needed all those years ago." David didn't defend himself. He simply said, "I know." It was one of the hardest things he had ever admitted. He knew. He finally knew. But knowing now didn't change what had happened. It only gave him the opportunity to behave differently going forward. Sarah took his hand. Neither of them said anything for several minutes. That silence was different from the silence they had experienced years earlier. Before, silence meant distance. Now, silence meant comfort. But just when David began believing they might actually find their way back to each other, Sarah received another opportunity. It was a position in yet another city, one that would give her financial independence and allow her to be closer to her mother. The offer was excellent. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had once dreamed about. But accepting it would mean leaving David again. This time, Sarah didn't hide it from him. She showed him the offer immediately. David read it carefully. Then he looked at her and asked what she wanted. Sarah said she didn't know. She was afraid that choosing the job would destroy whatever they were rebuilding. But she was equally afraid that turning it down would make her resent him later. David told her not to turn it down for him. Sarah asked why. He said because that was the mistake they had made before. They had both been making decisions based on fear of losing each other. He didn't want either of them to live that way anymore. If Sarah wanted the opportunity, he would support her. But he also told her something else. He didn't want another relationship built around waiting. If they chose to continue, they needed to find a way to live together rather than constantly living apart. Sarah asked what he meant. David said he was willing to move. Not because she demanded it, not because he was trying to prove something, but because he had finally realized that the life he wanted was not tied to one particular city, position, or salary. Sarah stared at him. For years, she had been the one asking David to come closer. Now he was offering to move toward her without being asked. That was the moment something inside her finally softened. She told him she was scared. David said he was too. She told him she didn't know if she could trust him completely yet. David said he understood. She told him that she couldn't promise they would never have another difficult season. David smiled and said he wasn't asking for that promise. He only wanted them to promise that when difficult seasons came, they wouldn't disappear from each other. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. For the first time since their separation, she said the words David had been waiting months to hear. "I still love you." David closed his eyes for a moment. He had imagined hearing those words so many times. But when they finally came, they didn't feel like a victory. They felt like a responsibility. Because now he understood that being loved by Sarah wasn't something he had won. It was something he had to protect through his actions. They decided to try again. Not secretly, not casually. They told the people closest to them. They began making plans. David prepared to change his work arrangement. Sarah started organizing her move. They looked at houses. They discussed finances. They talked about what had gone wrong and what they would do differently. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes old fears returned. Sometimes David became too focused on work. Sometimes Sarah became distant when she felt uncertain. But this time they talked about it instead of letting silence grow. Then came the night David returned home with the suitcase. It was months after they had decided to rebuild their relationship. From the outside, everything seemed fine. But that night, David had received a phone call that shook him. His company had made a final decision about his position. The arrangement he had negotiated was no longer available. He had two choices: accept the major promotion and relocate permanently, or resign from the company and walk away from the career he had spent decades building. David sat in his car outside the house, staring at the suitcase. He had already packed. Sarah knew something was wrong. She had heard him moving around, but she didn't come downstairs. Instead, she sent him a message. "If you're leaving, please don't wake me." David read it again, and suddenly, the meaning of the night became clear. He wasn't sitting there because he didn't love Sarah. He was sitting there because he believed loving her might require him to destroy the other part of his life. His career, his financial security, his identity, everything he had spent decades building. And somewhere between fear and responsibility, David convinced himself that leaving was the only honest choice. He opened the car door, stepped outside, picked up the suitcase, then stopped, because for the first time in his life, David asked himself a question he had avoided for years. What if I am making the same mistake again? He looked at the house, then at the suitcase, and realized that perhaps the real choice wasn't between Sarah and his career. Perhaps the choice was between the man he had always been and the man he had promised Sarah he would become. David walked back toward the front door, but before he could reach it, his phone rang. It was Sarah, and what she said next would determine whether their second chance was truly a second chance, or simply another chapter in the same old story. David stood outside the front door with one hand resting on the handle and the suitcase beside his feet. His phone was still against his ear. On the other end, Sarah was breathing quietly. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. David had spent years believing that the hardest decisions in life were the ones where you had to choose between two things you wanted. But standing there that night, he finally understood that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones where fear makes you believe there are only two choices. He could leave and accept the promotion, or he could stay and give up the career he had spent decades building. At least, that was what David had been telling himself. Sarah's voice finally broke the silence. She asked him where he was. David looked through the window beside the door and saw her standing upstairs. She was looking down at him. He told her he was outside. Sarah asked, "Are you leaving?" David looked at the suitcase. Then he looked back at her, and this time, he didn't answer immediately. Sarah came downstairs. David watched her walk toward the front door. When she opened it, she didn't look angry. She didn't look surprised either. She looked tired, but there was something else in her expression. Acceptance. She stepped outside and saw the suitcase. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Sarah asked him what had happened. David explained that his company had made its final decision. The position he had negotiated was gone. If he wanted to keep the promotion, he would have to move. If he refused, he would have to leave the company. Sarah listened carefully. She didn't tell him what to do. She didn't cry. She didn't ask him to stay. And strangely, that made David feel more afraid than anything she could have said. Because years earlier, Sarah would have begged him to choose her. Now she simply stood there, waiting for him to make his own decision. David realized that this was the moment he had been preparing for without knowing it. He had spent years asking what he could sacrifice for love. Now he had to ask what kind of life he actually wanted. David told Sarah that he had already made a decision. He was going to leave. Sarah nodded slowly. There was pain in her eyes, but she didn't stop him. Then David continued. He said he was going to leave the company, not her. Sarah stared at him. David explained that he had spent years believing his career was the foundation of his life. He had confused income with security, achievement with purpose, and sacrifice with love. He said that if he lost a promotion, he could rebuild his career. If he lost money, he could earn more. If he changed his plans, he could create new ones. But he had already learned what it felt like to lose Sarah, and he wasn't willing to repeat that experience simply because he was afraid of starting over professionally. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. David told her he wasn't asking her to save him. He wasn't asking her to be responsible for his decision. He was simply making the choice for himself. For the first time, he was choosing a life rather than chasing an image of success. Sarah stepped closer to him. She looked at the suitcase and asked why he had packed it. David smiled sadly. He admitted that he had been ready to run again. He thought leaving would make things easier for her. He thought if he removed himself from the equation, she wouldn't have to watch him struggle with the decision. But then he remembered something she had told him years earlier. She hadn't needed him to make everything easy. She had needed him to stay present when things became difficult. David told her that was what he was finally going to do. Sarah reached for his hand. She didn't say that everything was forgiven. She didn't pretend the years apart hadn't happened. Instead, she told him something far more meaningful. She said, "I don't need you to promise me that nothing will ever go wrong again. I need you to promise that when something does go wrong, you won't decide for both of us that leaving is the answer." David promised. And this time, the promise was different. It wasn't a promise about a perfect future. It was a promise about how they would handle an imperfect one. The suitcase remained outside the door. David left it there. The next morning, he contacted his company and officially declined the promotion. It wasn't an easy decision. He lost a significant amount of money and walked away from a position he had spent years working toward. Some people around him didn't understand. A few told him he was making a mistake. One colleague asked him why he would throw away such a valuable opportunity. David didn't know how to explain that he wasn't throwing away his life. He was simply choosing a different definition of success. For years, he had believed success meant reaching the highest position he could. Now he believed success meant being able to look at his life and recognize the people in it. He knew there would be financial consequences. He knew there would be difficult adjustments. But he also knew something he had learned too late. There is no promotion big enough to compensate for spending your life beside the person you love while emotionally living somewhere else. The months that followed weren't magically perfect. David and Sarah still had disagreements. They still had moments when old fears returned. Sometimes Sarah became quiet because she was afraid David would change his mind. Sometimes David became anxious because he worried that one mistake would send them back to where they had been. But now they had a new rule. They talked before the silence became distance. If one of them was hurt, they said it. If one of them needed help, they asked. If work became overwhelming, they discussed it. They stopped assuming that the other person could read their mind. It sounds simple, but for David and Sarah, it was one of the biggest changes they had ever made. Their relationship no longer depended on one person guessing what the other needed. They began treating communication as part of the relationship rather than something they only needed when things went wrong. Eventually, Sarah accepted the new position she had been considering, but she didn't move alone. David and Sarah found a way to create a life that allowed both of them to pursue meaningful work while remaining together. It wasn't exactly the future they had imagined when they were younger. It was different, but perhaps that was the point. The future they had once imagined had been built around assumptions. They thought they would know exactly where they would live, what they would earn, how their careers would unfold, and what retirement would look like. Life had shown them that none of those things were guaranteed. What mattered was how they responded when their plans changed. They stopped asking, "How do we make our original plan work?" and started asking, "What kind of life can we build from where we are now?" One evening, several months later, David and Sarah returned to the little cafe where they had first met. The place had changed slightly. The tables were different. The menu had changed. But the corner where they had first spoken was still there. David smiled when he saw it. Sarah asked what he was thinking. He told her he was thinking about how strange life could be. A random morning, a spilled stack of papers, a brief conversation, two strangers who had no idea they were about to become the most important people in each other's lives. Sarah smiled and reminded him that she had almost walked away from that first conversation because she thought he looked too serious. David laughed and said he was glad she stayed. Sarah looked at him and replied, "You almost didn't." David knew exactly what she meant. He had almost walked away many times. Not because he didn't love her, because he did. He had convinced himself that love meant protecting Sarah from his problems. He thought if he couldn't give her everything, he should give her nothing. He thought walking away would save her from disappointment. But Sarah had never needed a perfect man. She had needed an honest one. A man who could admit when he was afraid. A man who could say, "I don't know what happens next, but I want to figure it out with you." David had spent years believing strength meant carrying everything alone. Sarah taught him that sometimes strength means allowing someone else to carry part of the weight. And there was another lesson David never forgot. The danger in a relationship isn't always the argument. Sometimes it is the silence after the argument. It is the assumption that the other person already knows what you feel. It is believing that someone will always be there because they have been there before. It is postponing the conversation because you think tomorrow will be easier. It is telling yourself that once the job settles down, once the bills are paid, once the children are older, once the house is finished, once life becomes less complicated, then you will finally have time for the people you love. But sometimes tomorrow keeps moving. And if you're not careful, you can spend years preparing for a future that never arrives. David and Sarah eventually got married quietly, surrounded by the people closest to them. There was no extravagant ceremony. They didn't need one. The important part had already happened. They had lost each other once and found their way back. They had learned that love wasn't simply the feeling that brought two people together. It was the daily decision to remain present when things became uncomfortable. It was choosing conversation over silence, understanding over assumptions, partnership over pride. They knew there would be difficult years ahead. They knew life would eventually bring sickness, financial challenges, family responsibilities, and losses that neither of them could predict. But they no longer believed that avoiding hardship was the purpose of love. They understood that sometimes love means facing hardship together. Years later, David would occasionally tell the story of the suitcase. Not because he was proud of it, but because he wanted people to understand how close he had come to making the biggest mistake of his life. He would tell them that the suitcase was already packed. The decision was already made. He had been sitting in that car, ready to leave the woman he loved, because he believed he was doing the honorable thing. But the truth was that he was afraid. He was afraid of failing, afraid of losing his identity, afraid of disappointing people, afraid that if he couldn't provide everything, he wasn't enough. And in trying to protect himself from those fears, he almost sacrificed the one thing he actually wanted. Sarah sometimes told the story differently. She would say that the night David almost left was also the night she stopped waiting for him to become the man she needed. She had realized that she couldn't force someone to choose her. She couldn't make David understand what she needed. She couldn't spend the rest of her life standing at a window, hoping he would eventually come home. So she had accepted that she might have to build a life without him. And perhaps that was what finally changed everything. David didn't return because Sarah begged him to. He returned because he finally understood that the choice had always been his. That is what makes their story so painful and perhaps so familiar. Because sometimes the person we almost lose isn't someone we stopped loving. Sometimes they're the person we loved so much that we became afraid of everything that could go wrong. We become so focused on protecting the relationship from hardship that we forget to actually live inside it. We wait for the perfect moment to say what we feel. We wait for life to become easier. We wait until we have more money, more time, more confidence, more certainty. And then one day, we look around and realize that the person we were waiting to enjoy life with has been waiting too. The difference is that they may not wait forever. David learned that love isn't a contract guaranteeing that nothing will hurt. It is a decision to be honest when something does hurt. It isn't a promise that two people will always agree. It is a commitment to keep talking when they don't. It isn't about finding someone who makes life easy. It is about finding someone with whom you are willing to face life honestly. And perhaps most importantly, love isn't something you should postpone until everything else is settled. Because everything else may never be settled. There will always be another bill, another deadline, another career decision, another family responsibility, another reason to say, we'll have time later. The question is whether the people you love will still be standing beside you when later finally arrives. David almost walked away from the love of his life. He almost convinced himself that leaving was the responsible thing to do. He almost turned fear into a decision and called it sacrifice. But at the last moment, he realized something that changed the direction of his life. He didn't need to choose between being successful and being loved. He needed to stop defining success in a way that required him to lose himself and the person he loved in the process. The suitcase that once sat beside him in the darkness eventually became a reminder. Not of the night he nearly left, but of the moment he finally understood what staying meant. Staying didn't mean never leaving the house. It didn't mean giving up every dream. It didn't mean becoming dependent on another person. It meant refusing to disappear when life became difficult. It meant looking at Sarah and saying, I don't know what happens next, and then adding, but I want to find out with you. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden inside David and Sarah's story. Sometimes the love of your life isn't lost because you stopped loving them. Sometimes you almost lose them because you waited too long to show them that they mattered. So if there is someone in your life who matters to you, don't assume they already know. Call them. Sit beside them. Have the conversation you've been postponing. Tell them what you feel while you still have a chance. Because David Carter learned something that many people don't understand until it is too late. You can rebuild a career. You can earn more money. You can change cities. You can start over. But when you lose the person you were supposed to share your life with, you may spend the rest of your life wishing you had chosen differently. And sometimes, the biggest tragedy isn't losing the love of your life. It's realizing that you were the one who almost walked away. If this story touched you, tell us in the comments. Have you ever walked away from someone you still loved? Or is there someone you wish you had fought harder to keep? And before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.